All right, lecture number 10. As we said in previous lectures, the Anti-Federalists opposed all of Alexander Hamilton's reports to Congress, the plans that he laid out to establish a firm financial footing for our new country. However, a compromise was reached on the issue of assumption at a dinner party hosted by Thomas Jefferson. I want to point out this one area where Federalists and Anti-Federalists were able to get along. At this dinner party, Jefferson invited Alexander Hamilton, Federalist, and James Madison, also Federalist at this time, to a dinner at his home. At the meeting, an agreement was reached. Madison agreed to support Hamilton's plans for assumption. Remember, assumption is the national government taking on state debts. So Madison agrees to support Hamilton's plans for assumption. In return, Hamilton would support Madison's project of building a new national capital in Virginia. Today we call it the District of Columbia, but that's largely carved out of the state of Virginia. So while the agreement is between two Federalists, Madison and Hamilton, it's at a dinner party hosted by the arch anti-Federalist. So we have an example of these two very distinct groups getting along on an issue. And the issue that they get along on is assumption. The federal government takes on state debt and we get a new national capital on the banks of the Potomac. The first 2 decades of American history were a period of almost constant feuding. We said that last time. Feuding over both domestic and international issues as the nation found its footing. Let's consider just a couple examples of this chaos, this feuding that goes on. I mentioned the Whiskey Rebellion last time. That's our first example. This takes place in the year 1794. Western regions, especially Kentucky and western Pennsylvania, rebelled against Alexander Hamilton's excise tax on whiskey that was being produced in these regions. The rebels saw Hamilton's excise tax as the same as those taxes imposed by Parliament during the reign of George III. President Washington ultimately raised an army and personally put down this short-lived insurrection. This is the only example we have in American history of a president leading an army into battle. And, there are some skirmishes, but there's really not much of a battle. Washington comes out of retirement, raises an army, marches into western Pennsylvania, and puts down the Whiskey Rebellion. The Anti-Federalists, of course, decried Washington's actions as tyranny. A second area where we have some disagreement in the first 2 decades of our country's history is over the National Army and National Navy. Federalists and Anti-Federalists disagreed about the need for a standing army. A standing army to defend not only against Indian threats in the West, but also to protect American shipping. Arthur St. Clair and Mad Anthony Wayne led small American armies against Indians in the Ohio territories in the 1790s. These forays into the wilderness here in Ohio culminated with the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, largely ending the Indian threat to settlers. After the Revolutionary War, we get thousands of people just pouring over the Appalachian Mountains here into the Ohio Valley. The country was also concerned about the continued presence of British troops, both here in the Ohio Valley and also up in the Great Lakes region. This was a violation of the Treaty of Paris, and it led to unrest all throughout the United States. A third issue over which there was tension in our early history is the French Revolution. French Revolution kicks off in 1789. What sort of position the fledgling American government should take on the French Revolution deeply divided the country. Federalists opposed involvement. They wanted to stay out of European affairs. Anti-Federalists, especially Thomas Jefferson, supported the revolution. They thought that the French revolutionaries were fighting for the same ideas, the same liberties that they had fought for just a decade earlier. The Anti-Federalist case for involvement was hurt by the presence of Citizen Genet, a French emissary devoted to whipping up support amongst the American people. Citizen Genet was a representative of the French government, the revolutionary government. He came to the United States, he spoke against President Washington, he spoke in favor of even broader liberties. He thought the American government was too oppressive. To Washington's credit, when the revolutionaries fell in France and it became unsafe for Citizen Genet to return home, Washington actually allowed him to stay here in America. Citizen Genet bought a small farm up in the northeastern part of the country and basically retired. But I think that was rather magnanimous of George Washington, having been the target of so many attacks from Citizen Genet. In 1793, shortly after the outbreak of war between France and England, Washington issued his neutrality proclamation. Anti-Federalists criticized neutrality as cowardly after the French supported the U.S. in the American Revolution. The Anti-Federalists said, look, Admiral de Grasse, Rochambeau, the French supported us in our revolution, we should support them in their revolution. Washington said, no, we're going to remain neutral. Washington, ever concerned about his legacy, believed that the overthrow of the monarchy in France relieved him of any debt of honor owed to the French. Now, emboldened by U.S. flirting with France, the British harassed American shipping and pursued a policy of impressment all along the East Coast. Impressment was basically kidnapping, sanctioned by the British government. British soldiers would go into American ports, they would go into taverns, they would pick American sailors who were drunk, and they would claim that they were British sailors having escaped from the Royal Navy, and they would basically kidnap them and bring them into British service. Or they would in fact board American vessels and claim that some of the sailors on those American vessels were really British sailors. This was kidnapping sanctioned by the British government, and obviously it's bothersome to President Washington. Recognizing we couldn't risk war, however, with Britain, President Washington sent John Jay to England to seek a formal peace treaty. What's known as Jay's Treaty comes in 1795, and it's viewed by many in America as appeasement to British bullying. The treaty was especially unpopular with anti-federalists in the South. Because the treaty was so unpopular, Jay said he could travel from one end of the country to the other by the light of fires from him being burned in effigy. One of the positive outcomes of Jay's Treaty, in addition to keeping the U.S. out of war with England, was that it scared the Spanish into signing what is known as Pinckney's Treaty. That also comes in 1795. Worried the Americans would ally with the British against them, the Spanish granted the Americans free navigation on the Mississippi River, very, very important. They granted them warehouse rights in New Orleans, and they granted them a large disputed territory in West Florida. Now, another reason that President Washington refused to support the French Revolution was that he saw it as qualitatively different from the American Revolution. So let's think about that for just a moment. The similarities and differences between the American and French revolutions have long been a topic of dispute between historians. The predominant view today is this: the American Revolution is largely seen today as conservative in nature. In other words, the colonists were seeking to protect their rights against a tyrannical king. So the king is seen as the radical. The colonists are seen as British subjects simply trying to preserve or conserve their rights. It's a conservative revolution, say many historians. The subsequent view on the French Revolution is this: the French revolutionaries were seeking to destroy the old order and literally create the world anew. So in this case, the revolutionaries are the radicals. In particular, the French revolutionaries sought to destroy the institutions that represented tradition. They went after the monarchy. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were beheaded. The French revolutionaries went after the church. The famous cathedral of Notre Dame was turned into the Temple of Reason by Robespierre. And the French revolutionaries went after the aristocracy. The well-born were threatened, harassed, and killed indiscriminately. Property was not protected by the revolutionary government. So this difference in the revolutions is very, very important to Washington. He says the French Revolution is not like the American Revolution, and as a result, we're not going to support it. We're not going to become involved. Let's look for a moment at Washington's farewell address. Remember, this is a tradition that he creates. Written largely by Alexander Hamilton, the address still expressed Washington's most fundamental beliefs. It urged future administrations to maintain a neutrality in foreign policy, lest America become entangled in foreign alliances. The famous phrase from this letter is "no entangling alliances." Washington wanted the United States to stay out of European affairs. It warned specifically not to get involved in European wars. Second, Washington cautioned against partisan behavior. He urged men not to fall prey to what he called faction. Today we would say partisanship. Thirdly, the address concluded with an appeal to the sacred. Washington called religion and morality the indispensable supports of the American government. Now, George Washington, at the end of 2 terms, is going to decide that it's finally time for him to retire to Mount Vernon and live out the rest of his days on his plantation. In 1796, Washington's vice president, John Adams, is elected the 2nd president of the United States. So let's take a look at Adams' 1 term as president. After Washington shocked the nation with the news that he would, like the Roman general Cincinnatus, retire at the height of his popularity, the question became who should lead the nation now. Alexander Hamilton was the first choice of the Federalists, but it became apparent that his financial policies had become so unpopular that he was really unelectable in today's terms. The choice fell to the experienced and well-respected, but often disagreeable, John Adams. Pitted against Adams was the anti-Federalist standard-bearer, Thomas Jefferson. In the end, Adams won a very close vote of 71 to 68 in the Electoral College and became the nation's 2nd president. As the 2nd highest vote getter, however, Jefferson became the vice president, right? We've rectified this in the Constitution today, but the vice president in those days was the 2nd place finisher. So we have a situation where we have a Federalist, John Adams, as president, and an anti-Federalist, Thomas Jefferson, as his vice president. Adams is best characterized by the well-known description that he was respected but not liked by the American people. Now, during the presidency of John Adams, an atmosphere of possible war with France was encouraged by high Federalists like Hamilton. Hamilton sought to tie the anti-Federalists to the French and to the French Revolution, to radicalism. He also sought to maintain good relations with Great Britain. In order to try to defuse the situation, Adams sent a peace delegation to France. French response was to demand a bribe before the delegation could even meet with the French foreign minister, Talleyrand. The French go-betweens were referred to by the American press as X, Y, and Z. Apparently they didn't have their names at the time of the printing. So this became known as the XYZ affair, and it led to war fever fed by the Federalists, war fever against the French. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, one of the American delegates, told the French that the Americans would spend millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. This event spelled the end of a possible long-term alliance with the French. Ironically, the XYZ affair also reduced the chances of a possible 2nd term for John Adams. Placing patriotism before party, Adams resisted the wishes of his own party regarding war with France, and he worked out a lasting peace with the French called the Convention of 1800. Now I'd like to talk about two pieces of legislation passed during the Adams administration. I would describe them as two of the more reprehensible pieces of legislation, certainly most questionable, if not reprehensible, pieces of legislation passed in American history. Here I'm talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. These clearly unconstitutional acts were born of war fever and President Adams' desire to protect the young nation while it found its footing. The Alien Acts empowered the president to arrest any foreign national without charge if he deemed him to be a quote-unquote threat. Now, to his credit, President Adams never used the Alien Acts. He did, however, use the Sedition Acts. The Sedition Acts protected the president and the government of the United States from public criticism. Notice they don't protect the vice president, who happens to be an anti-federalist. I always find that quite amusing. The Sedition Acts offered no protection to Thomas Jefferson. These acts were used over 24 times to arrest individuals who criticized either Adams or the American government. Probably the most well-known critic, most well-known victim of these acts was a congressman, Matthew Lyon, who was sent to jail for criticizing President Adams. Lyon got the last laugh, however, when he won re-election from his jail cell. These unconstitutional acts were refuted by Thomas Jefferson in the Kentucky resolutions and by James Madison in the Virginia resolutions. The two together reasserted states' rights and outlined the constitutional theory of nullification. Jefferson, anonymously, and Madison argued the rightful remedy to the federal government acting unconstitutionally is for the states to nullify those federal laws they deem unconstitutional. By doing so, Jefferson and Madison were suggesting the states should be the final arbiters in determining what is constitutional. This is a can of worms that has not been closed even today. We have many, many examples of nullification today. It's against the law to sell or distribute marijuana. That's against federal law. Well, there are many states that now say that medicinal marijuana can be used. There are a number of federal gun laws that have been declared nullified in states like Texas. So we have examples of nullification all across the board. This is the idea that states, because they created the Constitution, not the other way around, states have a right to nullify federal law. This is a disagreement that will probably go on well into the future. I want to finish this lecture and prepare us for the next by talking briefly about the election of 1800. After 12 years of continuous Federalist domination, the Anti-Federalists won both the presidency as well as a number of seats in the Senate and the House in 1800. Some historians suggest this was a larger revolution than 1776, and I would agree with this. The ideological change that takes place in 1800 far surpasses any sort of ideological change that takes place as a result of the American Revolution. These same historians refer to the Jefferson administration as the country's second founding period. And it's the Jefferson administration that will be our last topic in this series of lectures. Thanks very much.